One.
Welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell. I have been forced to omit middle names because Paddy was getting offended. But in the next podcast on a Thursday, you're actually going to hear the middle name because we do these in reverse order because we're smart like that.
Yeah, but they're actually in order now because
oh yeah,
that one came out last Thursday when we had a guest interview on the Monday. So they're actually in order now.
So you guys are in the future right now, time traveling.
Yes, that's correct, Gary. Anyway, what are we going to talk about in today's podcast?
We're going to talk about a very vague topic. No, we've got a good couple of points to present that I think will click with a lot of people. Fundamentally, we are going to be talking about consistency, the importance of consistency, and why people would be so much better off to actually focusing on developing consistent systems or habits or whatever in training, nutrition, other areas of life, rather than trying to constantly add in novelty and changes. Because obviously, it's cliche because it's important. Like, that's the important thing to understand here. That, like, people always say consistency is key, but I mean, like, it actually is. Like, that's why people say it so much. But you often don't see it employed very much in practice, in that people change around their diets very often. They don't have any consistency in what they eat day to day. They don't have a go-to schedule that they could, ring off, which isn't necessary, but it's definitely helpful. The same with training. Training weeks look different every week. Some weeks, they're very active. Some weeks they're not active at all. And if you can get some of those things in order, and you can lay a foundation of these basic habits, these basic routines, this consistency, then that's going to set you up for, if not getting better results, you're definitely not going to have the troughs that a lot of people experience. Like, your peaks will hopefully be higher, but your troughs will definitely not be as low. And for me, that is what this is all about. That's what health is all about. It's about setting yourself up so that you do not have a fragile approach. Ideally you want your approach to be robust, in that it's always holding you there. You're never getting into those deep troughs, but you want to be anti-fragile. You want to have a setup in all areas of life where when there's adversity, that's not a problem for you. You just get stronger because you actually modify your habits and you keep moving forward. So that's going to be the topic of today's podcast.
Absolutely wonderful. So essentially we're talking about consistency rather than novelty, which again, like Gary said, it seems like a cliched thing, and it's well, it is cliched because it's so fundamental to the whole process. So we're essentially going to attack this from two different sides. And again, that's the diet and then the training side of things, right? And first of all, the reason we're approaching this is because it's something that comes up all the time in our coaching practice, right? Because you could make a change to someone's diet, right? But making that change almost becomes an expectation, right? And they kind of want, every time they check in or whatever, especially at the initial period coaching someone, every time they check in, they kind of want you to make a change or to tweak something or to, move around some variable or address some variable. When in reality, once you've got a lot of things down, there is no reason to actually change things, right? They just need to be run, It's like you are a computer program and you just need to put all the inputs in, and then the computer program will run and then you'll get the output, right? And yeah, when you get the output, it might be slightly wrong and then you have to tweak a few variables, but you can't skip over the runtime. You can't skip that period. You may want to make it run faster or, do more or whatever. It's inbuilt into the system that there is going to be this time that you just have to effectively do the changes you've made. You just have to let them run their course, And again, as an individual, you kind of feel like, oh yeah, you should be making changes all the time. You should be tweaking this and you should be tweaking that, especially as you start this whole health and fitness journey, whatever. At the very start, you're kind of like, oh, I should be changing this, or, you know, oh, I heard this new concept and you're like, maybe I should apply that. And you're constantly adding new layers, variables, different things. And like Gary said, your diet might not look the same week to week. Your training might not look the same week to week. And as a result, you actually are never consistent, even if you are consistently dieting or consistently training. It's like you're not actually being consistent in your actions. Like, for example, you might be training 4 times per week, but there's actually no progression system within that. Every single session looks different. Like, there's no week on week building on what you built the week before. It's like every single week, to use a different analogy, it's like you're trying to build a village, you know, and every single week you lay the foundation for a house over here, and then over here you lay some bricks, and over here it's like you fucking thatch a roof or something. It's like none of this is joined together. It's like, yeah, you have all the different components of a certain house or whatever, but there's no cohesion between this. You know, it's like they might all be very good approaches and they might all be variables that you should be thinking of, but because you're never consistent in actually applying them in one direction, you're never actually moving towards your goals, you know, or you're haphazardly moving towards your goals. And that's why we're kind of going into this, because, you know, the desire to change things around is actually holding back a lot of people from actually achieving their long-term goals, you know. And this is to address both from the coaching perspective and then the individual perspective, like if you're coaching yourself, you know, because as a coach, especially if you're new to the industry, you can almost feel like you should be changing things around more frequently because the individual expects that, you know. Whereas the best thing you can actually do is to keep things consistent and get them to hammer down the consistent things, or rather the basics consistently, and that will actually get them results. Even if they're like, oh no, well, should I try this, or should I do this, and what about this? It's like all of that's irrelevant unless you're getting the basics, right? So we'll go into this a little bit more in depth so you can actually understand what we're kind of skirting around there. So look at it from a diet perspective, you know, like if we're looking at the diet, right, there are a few basic principles that should be guiding your life. And this holds true whether you're like the keto guy and the fucking vegan guy or whatever else, you know. There's a few basics that once applied, you are going to see progression, right? And the first one, we've said it before, is, you know, calories, you know. So if you're not consistent in your calorie intake, and I don't mean like you have to eat the exact same amount of calories per day. What I mean is you have to respect the thermodynamic principles. You know, you have to be at a calorie appropriate diet for your overall goals, you know. So once you're doing that, you'll see progress if you're consistent in it. If you're inconsistent in it, you know, some days you're eating fucking 500 calories and on other days you're eating 1,000 calories, and, you know, there's no logical reason in how you've actually structured your calories, then you're not going to get consistent results. Even if you're like, oh, well, I'm consistently eating. It's like, yeah, well, it's that you're not actually consistently doing the actual principle, you know. And you'll see this again if you're coaching individuals. People will not hit their calories. They'll just be like, this is the calorie level we should be at, right? And again, like there's different approaches you can go to that. You could be working on like portion sizes, or, you know, habits to achieve that, or whatever, you know. Or you could just be hitting, you know, calories and macro targets, you know, multiple ways to skin a cat with that. But if they're not actually following your calorie recommendations, like they're trying to gain weight and they're not actually eating the 500 calorie surplus that you recommend, or you're trying to lose weight and they're not, you know, eating the 500 calorie deficit that you recommend. I'm just pulling those numbers out of my ass, but, you know, the whatever number you choose, if they're not doing that, then they're not going to see results, you know. And they can be talking about whatever extra supplement they can bring in, and they're, oh, should I try, I don't know, fucking this pre-workout, or this creatine, or this fucking super pump 3000 fucking whatever. It's like all of that's irrelevant because you're not hitting the master key. You're not doing the one thing that is going to give you the 99.9% improvement, you know. So that's the first thing. You like the base principles of the diet firstly being, thermodynamics. If you're not respecting that, you're not going to see the results that you actually want to achieve. And that might seem really, really fucking obvious when you're in this world as a coach or as whatever, but it's actually somewhat, we'll say, deceptive to the Gen Pop, because what they see as consistent is not what you see as consistent, right? And what I mean by that is they might be consistent in trying to hit those calories Monday to Friday, but then on Saturday and Sunday, it's like, oh, well, that's the weekend. That's different, So they're not consistent across the longer time period that's actually required to see results, and they don't see that as an issue, because they're like, oh, well, it was only like, an extra, cake and that pizza and whatever. But I've been consistent with the meal plan you gave me, or the meal structure you gave me, or the calories and whatever you gave me. And I've been consistent with that 90% of the time, And this is the issue with training and the issue with nutrition. It's not like an a la carte menu where it's like, you can just be like, oh, I'll just pick this here and this, that, and this. Like, you actually have to look after all of the variables, but all of the time. It's a set meal plan, or not a set meal plan. It's a set meal, structure. It's like, this is your starter. This is your fucking main. This is your dessert. You don't get a choice. It's like, you can choose to only eat the starter and the dessert, but you're not, like, you can't, that's not going to lead to the results that you want. It's like, you have to eat the mains as well. You have to do the starter. You have to do, like, it's not a pick and choose. You have to look after your calorie input. You have to look after your calorie output. And you have to do that every single day, which is, again, the whole concept of this consistency versus novelty. What are your thoughts on that, Gary?
Yeah, I think it's important. I think an area that this probably, like, people don't think about this often in relation to is actually just kind of health in general, because I think a lot of people, they're like, oh yeah, well, not losing weight. Okay. All right. But at least I'm making the effort, to be healthier or whatever. And, but when you actually, like, strip it back, it's like, okay, so whole food based diet, it does seem like you're probably in a deficit in those 4 days. And it's like, yeah, they're probably good steps. But Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, if you're overfeeding on, let's say, a diet that's, very high in processed foods, maybe you're adding in additional alcohol and everything like that, you've got 3 of those days plus the Monday, like, afterwards. So you've got 4 out of 7 days per week, pretty much, where you're in a state of what one could call, like, metabolic dysregulation to some degree, because you're going to be, having much larger fluctuations in blood glucose and blood lipids after your meals. You're going to be a little bit less responsive to some of the hormonal signals after you eat and things like that. Potentially you're having, poorer sleep. And if you're binge drinking, like a lot of people do at the weekend, especially in Ireland, people are like, I wouldn't be much of a drinker only on the Saturday night, but they could have, like, 12, 15 drinks. Like, that's, like, not uncommon. Again, exposing your liver and other organ systems, your brain, to all of this toxicity. And then if you actually were to zoom it out,
Gary, isn't it?
Oh yeah, all the time. If you were to zoom out and look on average, then you'd be saying, well, actually, like, you're actually not doing great in terms of health. Like, I know you identify as a healthy person because of your decisions from Monday to Thursday, and maybe you have that intent. But on average, like, if we were to, look at a summary over a course of multiple months, your approach is actually, like, not healthful at all. Whereas someone who is maybe they're quite consistent, but if you look at any one day, you're not like, person's probably not a health freak. They're not Monday to Thursday, they don't have all their meals in lunch boxes or whatever, but they have some eggs when they get up and a bit of toast and maybe a bit of fruit at their morning break. They have at lunch, and then they have a dinner, whatever their mother's making, and maybe they have a couple of drinks a couple of nights per week. And when you look at that person's approach on average, it's like, yeah, this person doesn't look very health conscious. But when you look at it over multiple months and compare it to the health conscious person, it's like, yeah, you're actually doing a better job. And you do see that a lot in the fitness industry. Even people who are promoting themselves as, quote unquote influencers, you'll see that their weekends can often be, quite messy. And if you were to average that out across the week, sometimes it doesn't look all that helpful. So that's why I'm saying that, you don't need to judge yourself based on, having the perfect approach on Monday. I mean, having like a sandwich for lunch is something that's almost like viewed as like not healthy these days. It's like, what? You don't have your Tupperware, but you could be doing a much better job than the person with the Tupperware from Monday to Thursday. So you do need to look at that on average over time.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard because when you discuss all of this stuff about like essentially being consistent, it almost makes it sound like you have to do an all or nothing approach, right?
Yeah.
And I don't want that to be the message you take away from this. Like what we're actually talking about is actually understanding what consistency actually means, right? And that doesn't mean that it has to be all or nothing, where it's like, oh, if you're not consistent, you might as well just fucking give up and not even try, right? But what we're trying to say is, like if you are trying to get results in whatever, health, performance, body composition, whatever it is, if you're trying to get results in those areas, you actually have to be aware of what consistency actually means for that, right? Like I think it's easier to see in terms of performance, right? Especially we'll talk from like a powerlifting perspective, right? So you're trying to get better at the squat, bench, deadlift. If you just, every second workout, just skipped the squats you do. Say you just literally do 3 workouts per week, and one of them is a squat focus, one is a bench focus, and one is a deadlift focus. And we'll just make it easy, right? And every second week, you're just not doing the squat one. You're just not doing it. You just skip it. Like you would automatically be like, yeah, I'm not going to achieve my squat goals, and that also actually might affect my, other goals because I'm not consistent with my training as a whole. And, like there's some carryover between squats and deadlifts. So I'm maybe not getting the full body stimulus and all this kind of stuff. And you're like, okay, well, that's probably a bad approach if my goal is to get better at the squat, bench, and deadlift, So you can very easily see that, right? Because you're like, oh, I'm skipping that every second week. So I'm essentially getting half the results as a result, but you might be still be getting results, which is the deceptive thing, essentially if you're hitting your squats every second week because you're essentially skipping it every other week, you are still getting that stimulus. You're still probably making some sort of progress, again, depending on your training experience, etc. So you can be deceived into thinking it's like, oh yeah, this is fine. Like I'm still progressing in my squats, like I'm just not progressing at the rate I want, but there's still progress. And you know what I mean? Progress is progress. So you kind of fool yourself and you're like, that's actually, yeah, it's fine that I skip every second week. It's not a big issue. Like, yeah, I probably should go, but who really cares? When in reality, it's like, yeah, but like if you actually push that out over a longer time course, like, yeah, over a 12-week period, you don't really care that, oh, well, I only gained 5 kilos on my squat versus 10 kilos. It's like, that doesn't, like, yeah, you would love the 10 kilos increase, but it's not that big a deal. But if you actually push that out over a bigger time course, we'll say across your training, career, you could have gained 100 kilos on your squat, just to make the numbers easy, 100 kilos on your squat. Over the 10, 15, 20 years that you've been training, you've only gained 50 kilos. It's like you've actually left 50 kilos on the table because you chose to not be consistent with that. And I think that's a lot easier for people to see that because it's obviously an easy metric to track. And obviously, it's like, oh, well, you can actually see the issue. But it's the exact same with the diet and with training as a whole, in terms and health as well, where it's like you are making these trade-offs and you have to be aware of them. And then you have to be okay with them, if you're choosing to engage in those activities. Right. And again, I don't want it to be like an all or nothing, like, oh, if you're not doing all of these things, you might as well fucking quit. But if you know that you like to smoke cigarettes and you're willing to have that health issue, like, and potential health issues, and you're like, I'm actually okay with that. Like, you've made that trade-off, right? Like, as an individual, it's the same with the diet. It's like, oh, well, if you choose to not eat the calorie level that is appropriate for your goals, you have to be like as a result, okay with the trade-off of not achieving your results in the given time period that you said you wanted to achieve them, you know? And if you're not okay with it, then you have to change the habits that are detracting you from actually achieving those goals. Like, again, if you're not willing to be consistent, but you still want results, you essentially have to push the time horizon out further, or you have to be willing to accept a lower magnitude of results, you know? But that's not what people do. People expect the 12-week transformation, or people expect the 100 kilos on their squat, even though they're not actually consistent in the things that are going to allow them to achieve that, you know?
Yes, sir.
All right, just don't say anything at all, Gary. That's fantastic.
I thought you might have a question for me. I just agree with you. I think it was a good point. But anyway, no, like I think a good way to understand like where this fits into place is the way that most people approach their education as well. You know, people have this approach towards education, like in university at least, where they kind of just, you know, push everything towards the back end and just kind of cram before their exams. And you do get this kind of like, yeah, there's some novelty in it. Like, oh, you feel like you learned everything. Like, boom, I knew all this right before the exam. But then you just kind of forget it because you just learned it off. You use kind of quick fixes. You know, you had all these mnemonics to remember things and all these study hacks, but you never really understood what you actually learned. You never created, you know, that solid base. Whereas if you're an individual who, like, this is the type of approach I would have towards studying, where you're kind of doing a bit all the time. You're not I would never consider myself to be a good studier, in that I'm not one of those, like, if you come to me for study hacks for trying to remember things, I'm like, yeah, that's not me. Like, that's not my interest. And even if that means me maybe doing a little bit less on one exam, or a little bit worse, I don't particularly mind, because my goal is to understand things, and that's all I want. Like, studying medicine now, my goal is to understand things, to understand how everything works together, not to remember mnemonics of certain things that are going to just, they might stay in my brain, but I'll never understand how those things actually fit it together. Okay, so if you adopt that sort of approach, where I'm consistent, I'm adopting the kind of slower, less sexy approach, but ultimately, like, that's what leads to better outcomes in the long term. In that, if you're trying to genuinely understand things, you're picking the things that are actually important, as opposed to what might be high yield on an exam, and you're really focusing on trying to understand those things, then that's what makes you a better professional in the end, because you actually retain the information. Whereas the people that just remembered things, they got the quick fix, they got the short term, you know, novelty effect. Yeah, they can remember some muscles. Like, they might, like, for example, if it's anatomy, it's like, yeah, I remember there was the rhomboid. Was it one of the ones at the back? And I had a mnemonic for remembering the attachments, but they never truly understood, right, what are the functional implications of this? Like, if this muscle attaches here and it attaches to these intervertebral joints and it also attaches to the scapula, what are the implications of that for function? Like, that's important. And like, in some of my exams in like physiology and anatomy, like physiology actually they do, but anatomy, for example, they're not necessarily testing that stuff. It's like, all right, can you remember where this is? Can you point it out? But the functional implications are lost on people. And that doesn't actually bring you anywhere going forward. You can't use that information, and information is there to be used. But anyway, that's a sort of an aside, but it's very relevant, because if you can adopt that sort of longer term approach and ask yourself truly, like, what is the end outcome I want? Then you can make much better decisions with your training and nutrition. Because with your nutrition, when trying to set up an approach for the long term, your goal fundamentally is to come up with a dietary system in the end that carries you forward with good body composition and health and performance for decades. Like, that's what you want. So if you're not constantly contributing to the process of developing that, then you're never really moving forward. You're kind of going this way, then that way, then this way, then backwards, and you're never really getting anywhere. Like, you might experience some short-term weight loss because you started a certain system, but if that wasn't actually being built into your everyday life, then that's just not helpful. You know, you want to find ways that you can tweak the variables that are somewhat constant in your day-to-day life in favor of you moving in the right direction. So if you're currently sitting there and you're like, I'm so, I'm so lazy with my lunch. I wish I was like the people that prep their meals every day, but I actually just buy a sandwich and a bag of crisps at work every day. I know it's terrible, isn't it? But it's not. That's the thing. Like, all you have to do is say to yourself, okay, sandwich and crisps, that's consistent. I already know I can stick to that. So why don't I choose one of the other sandwiches that maybe has less mayo, doesn't have bacon or something like that, and an apple instead? Like, it doesn't require you to change your routine. It probably doesn't require you to change your expenditure, like financially. It doesn't require you to add any additional preparation. So that's just a very slight little tweak. And they're the types of things that matter. I've talked about it before, but one of the constants in my day, like with my diet, is pretty much my breakfast. Like, most of the time, if you looked back over the last 2 to 3 years, like probably much longer, like, I have porridge for breakfast. Like, that's mostly what I do. So I'll have porridge for breakfast, with fruit, dark chocolate, whey protein, plus or minus other things. So if I was in a dieting phase, I might have a little bit less dark chocolate. I'll reduce the portion of my oats slightly, but that's pretty much it. It's enough to take away maybe 100, 200 calories. And if I make a similar change later in the day, that's enough for me to complete my deficit. There's no like, oh, I'm starting dieting now, time to get on the diet. Similarly, there's no time to get on the bulk, time to get on the surplus, and then looking on Google, like, what are the best bulking foods. It's just like, no, I actually now have 120 grams of oats instead of 100, and now I have 1.5 of the bars of dark chocolate that I normally use, and now I'm moving in the right direction. Again, no change to my day-to-day life, can get on with my life. I don't need to change where I shop. I don't need to order anything online. Don't need to spend extra time prepping my meals. I do the exact same thing. And that's what creates longevity,
You're dead right. And like this, again, like, it kind of seems like very simplistic and also easy to misrepresent what we're saying. But effectively, whatever diet paradigm you fall into, none of them work unless you're consistent with them, and that's kind of what I want you to take away from this. It shouldn't be like, oh, I should be changing things all the time. Like, even Gary was saying, like, you make a small tweak here, like, that should be done and then run for like 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 7 weeks, or whatever. And it's like, see how that has affected you. It shouldn't be like, oh, well, this week I dropped half of that chocolate bar that you put in your fucking oats, and oh, well, yeah, like, that was great, but then next week I'm going to drop it down to 100 grams of oats, and then next week I'm like, oh, actually, I'm gonna get rid of the chocolate, and and then next week it's like, oh, I'm actually going to do 80 grams of oats, and it's like, why are you changing things so frequently? Like, that's just, it's essentially not trusting the process, and like that again, like, if you are an experienced coach or you're an experienced individual and you know that these little tweaks are actually what's needed to change you in the right direction, it's like, fine. But if you are someone that's just like, okay, well, like, I just want to achieve some results and whatever, it's like, the less frequent you can make changes and the longer you can run those changes, probably the better. Like, if you can make a small calorie adjustment, run that until it stops working, then you're going to be in a great place, and then you can adjust from there. But there shouldn't be very frequent changes, because what are you actually adapting to then? You're adapting to change, which is not actually what you want. You want to adapt to what you are trying to adapt to. If you want to try to adapt to a calorie deficit, it's like, you want to try to adapt to a 200 calorie deficit, not, oh, well, this week I was in 200, then next week I was in 1,000, but then I started binging on the weekend as a result, so I actually brought that back up and now it's a 500, but then there was still that binge midweek, so now I had to drop it to 1,000. And it's like, what are you actually adapting to? It's like, this is all over the place. There's no consistency in your approach that you can actually then base changes off of. And this is the same with, this is why, like, we generally don't use different calorie levels on like training days and non-training days. Like, yeah, it is a valid approach in some instances and it does help some individuals, but because it's a variable that you've introduced, which again can have its benefits, you can see like huge variability in the scale, and that can be really off-putting, because you're like, one day you're like, oh, well, I'm actually down 2 kilos, and the next day you're up 4 kilos, and you're like, what the fuck, like how do I track this? And obviously, again, like, you have to look over the longer time period. But again, that comes down to the consistency thing, where you're like, oh, you consistently know every time you have one of your low carb days, you drop 2 kilos. cool. That's a consistent now that you know that that's in place, but it takes a little bit longer to actually know that that's in place, because again, like there's so much variability in your other days, but that's a bit of an aside, right? So that, I think, gets people thinking about that, especially in terms of diet, and that's especially in terms of your overall calories, but it also applies to other aspects of the diet, right? And what I mean by this is, excuse me, the foods you eat, this is something that I think people in the, we'll call it the IIFYM community, or, the calories and macro community, do really poorly. And it has both its benefits and its negatives. And it is eating a huge variety of foods, right? And that might seem like, oh, well, like that's good. You want to have, a diverse variety of micronutrient rich foods and, cycle them in and out of your diet. And that's definitely something that we recommend. However, what a lot of people do is they try to be as exotic with their food selection as they possibly can be to still hit their numbers. Like there's no, like if I was like, oh, tell me what the 5 like kind of staple meals you have in a week are, or, what are the few different foods that you eat? And they're like, oh man, I eat completely differently every single day, and it's like, okay, well that's beneficial to an extent, but it's like, there is no consistency in this. Like, do you know how your body responds to chicken, say? Like, how do you feel after eating that? And you're like, well, I don't know. When was the last time you had chicken? I could have had it 3 times this week, 4 times this week, once per week. I don't know. Like, I have literally something different every single day, And it's like, yeah, okay, there is a benefit to this. There is a benefit to this, but you're noticing that you're having this like GI upset, and because you have so much variability in here, it's like we can't solve this. We can't dial in on a specific that might be causing you an issue. And then if you're like, oh, well, like, some days I'm up 2 kilos and other days I'm down 2 kilos. And it's like, well, what did you do different on those days? It's like, oh, I don't know. It's like, was there certain foods that you ate that, you noticed you had like extra gas or, water retention from your, I don't know, because there's so much like novelty in it. You're just trying to essentially hit numbers. You're like, I'm going to see what the fuck I can fit in to hit my numbers, And again, like that has some validity to it, but you've actually just brought in a huge amount of novelty and gotten rid of all the consistency that allows you to then actually see how your diet is affecting you as an individual. And this applies to both like food selection and we'll call it food timing, like if I'm like, oh, well, like how do meals affect you in terms of training? Like, what do you mean? And you're like, well, like, can you eat before training? Like, do you need a meal 2 hours before training? Like what suits you best in terms of, how you feel when you're training? You're like, I don't know. Like I just don't know. And you're like, what do you mean you don't know? And it's like, oh, well, some days I have 500 calories before training. Some days I don't eat before training. Some days I, eat an hour before training. Some days I eat like 15 minutes before training. And there's just a huge amount of variability. And it's like, it's extremely hard to then compare like, oh, this squat workout to the next squat workout you did, because you're like, oh, well, they're the same workout on paper, but all the variables around them, you swapped up so much. So I don't know if the fact that you didn't get the reps you got last week is a result of you, being quote unquote overtrained, or the fact that you only ate 200 calories 3 hours beforehand and you were feeling extremely hungry, or you didn't have like a consistent level of water intake. Like you've just brought in all these extra variables, and I don't know if they're the reason you're not progressing or the training program, Can you speak to that, Gary?
Yeah, like, I mean, like, again, like one of the areas that this tends to come up as well is like people who they're like, yeah, I kind of fast sometimes, I'm like, oh, yeah, I fast sometimes. And oh yeah, when do you fast? Do you have a consistent routine? It's like, yeah, no, not really. Sometimes I just cram all my calories in at the end of the day. Other times I cram all my calories in at the start of the day. I was like, how does that affect your training? And then it's like, it's grand. I don't really know because I don't have any consistency, and you don't end up with anything that you can actually use to make decisions. But even more than that, and something you're not going to necessarily observe is, like, as we've discussed before, like your body starts to develop and entrain the rhythms of multiple different processes in response to the inputs that you provided, okay, and that are provided from the environment. But if you're constantly changing when you eat the majority of your calories, the composition of those meals, then your metabolic response to those meals might not be as good as it otherwise would be. Like, for example, if you do like 2 days, let's say, where you eat all your calories at breakfast, like some people do this where they're like, yeah, just like one meal a day, bro. And then they do like, the evening the next time, your body was essentially being entrained to expect, a big bolus of food in the morning time, then you give it again, and you can end up with some level of metabolic dysregulation in response to that. So like that's one factor that may not be seen, but what you're talking about here is the stuff that you can actually use to make decisions. And if you can start to get an idea of how you're actually responding to your meals, then you can make much better decisions. Like one example might be the types of foods that you are typically used to eating before training, so that then reduces the amount of variability that you have in your performance in the gym. Because what might happen is that you normally have a meal, 2 hours before, sometimes, but then sometimes you have 1 hour before, sometimes you have 15 minutes before, as you said, but the foods that you're eating are always changing. And some days you find that you're real bloated and that, you can't really get your belt on, and that affects your ability to brace, and you don't really feel like that into training, and you skip your cardio after because, you get a bit of a stitch. If you can have some consistency there, then you can start to analyze why those things might be happening. Do you have more gas one day? Okay, why might that be? Was the banana that you had in your porridge, was it green? Okay, that might give us some indication as to why that might be the case. But if you have consistency there, you can gather that information. If you don't have consistency, you can't gather that information, and you're always left kind of guessing pretty much, or hoping for the best.
Yeah, and I think it's, again, easy enough to see in terms of the food selection. So you might be like, okay, cool. Like I want to have some variability in my food, but I want to have some consistency in those variables. It's like, oh, I have a handful of breakfasts that I cycle between. They're all roughly similar calorie, protein, macro breakdown, whatever, and you're like, okay, cool. That's cool. Same with lunches, same with dinners. You have like some consistency, and some consistency in the times you eat them relative to, say, training or whatever, Again, I think people can see that would be a good approach, and they're like, okay, so I can see what they're saying, like, don't bring in a lot of novelty at the expense of consistency. But this is another area, and like it was the next one I wanted to get onto, but you've just mentioned it as well, which is the kind of entrainment aspect, right? Because this is what people will do as well. They'll have a really rigid structure Monday to Friday, and then Saturday and Sunday, it's like, that's just completely out the window, And like you touched on it before as well, where you're kind of like, you essentially with like, say, alcohol and stuff, where it's like, you might be out doing unhealthful habits, we'll say, consistently, Friday to Sunday or whatever. But it's like, those things actually throw you off for the rest of the week as well. Because, say, even if you're not doing unhealthful habits, but, you have a consistent schedule, you're like, well, I work 9 to 5, I go to the gym beforehand 5 days per week, even if one of them is just a cardio session or something, it's like, I have a consistent schedule, train in the morning, go to work, eat in the evening, watch Netflix, whatever, consistently get my 10K steps per day, whatever it is, But then on the weekend, it's like, oh yeah, I actually sleep in 4 hours on a Saturday, and then I stay up an extra 2-3 hours on the Saturday as well. And then on the Sunday, it's like, oh, I feel tired, but, I wake up at, 12 in the middle of the day. I struggle to get my calories in. They're all over the place. And then, I know I have work on the Monday, so I have to go to bed early, but I'm not tired. So I go into the Monday tired then because I didn't sleep enough. And it's like, you've actually just thrown yourself off by having no consistency in the structure of your overall week, And again, like, this is not to say that you have to have, rigid meal timing. It's like, oh, your phone is, or your watch is beep, beep, beep. You have to have your meal at 7 a.m. It's like, that's not what I'm saying, that it's like, it has to be extremely rigid, but there should be some consistency. And again, if you go back to our sleep episode, where it's like, there should be some consistency in your, sleep and wake times, across the week, even if it is, like an hour or two out, that, again, I don't think that's a huge issue, but there still should be some consistency there, that it's like, this forms the foundation of your life, not just, your health and fitness goals. It's like, from that consistency, then you can start making changes and start assessing how you respond. But again, it's like if you just brought in a load of novelty, even if it is just sleeping extra on the weekend, it's extremely hard to then see how your sleep is being affected by other variables. Like if you're trying to dial in your sleep and you're like, yeah, I can nail it down Monday to Thursday, I'm really, really nailing it down. And then you just bring in all this novelty on the other days. Like, I don't know how much of the Monday to Thursday is being affected by the novelty you brought in on the Friday to Sunday. I'm like, are you coming into Monday extremely tired now because you have this altered pattern and you're trying to wake up when you're in a different stage of sleep, and you're tired throughout the day, and again, like, you start reaching for some caffeine, and it's like there's so much variability, even though you might think that you're being consistent with your sleep overall, because you're like, oh, well, Monday to Friday I go to sleep at 10, and Monday to Friday I wake up at 6 a.m. or whatever it is, and you're like, yeah, I'm being consistent with that. But then it's like, okay, can we just extend that out even 2 days? And it's like, okay, you're not being consistent with that on 2 out of 7 days. It's like, again, like, let's extend that out over the weeks, the months, or whatever. It's like, that's literally 2/7 of your life that you're not being consistent. It's like, and again, I go back to that like squat analogy. It's like, okay, if we have 7 workouts in a week and you just skip 2 of them every single week, it's like, you can't say that they're part of your workout. You can't say that they're part of your training week if you just consistently skip those 2 workouts. Like you'd be like, oh yeah, I train 5 days per week, because you don't train on the other 2 days. You're not consistent with them. Like, while your program might say 7 days of training per week, you're only doing 5 of those training sessions. So it's like, you have to be willing to accept that that is going to affect your results. And again, I'm not saying that it has to be an all or nothing approach where it's like, well, if you don't get your 8 hours or you're inconsistent with your sleep on the weekends, just fucking give up. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, you have to be willing to accept the trade-offs of that, or you have to be willing to go, okay, this is actually an issue that might actually be hindering my goals that I say I have. And either I have to change my expectations or my goals, or I have to actually change my habits, my lifestyle, whatever, to actually be consistent with the values I say I have,
Yeah, and I mean, like this gets to the crux of really what we're trying to get people to think about, and that is the fact that there are many, many little wins that you can actually begin to accumulate through simply adjusting some of the things that you already do, rather than adding in more things to do. And one of the places that's really, instructive here is the question that we often get, like, how can I improve recovery? What can I do? What can I add to improve recovery? What are your favorite recovery tools, etc.? And this is a mindset that, is very much, nourished by the fitness industry, the general conversation, because people are generally trying to sell, or not even sell, but try to push their approach on you. And when people are doing that, it's generally the addition of something new, the addition of something novel. It's always, cover, they need to add in something new. Whereas, like, the easiest thing that you can do is begin to play around with some of the things that you already do. So if you're struggling with recovery, you're feeling generally fatigued, you're feeling muscle soreness going on for days, etc., and you're not feeling like you're ready to come in and perform again, then the best things to do are to start off by saying, okay, what does my week look like currently? All right, there's 3 nights where I'm sleeping 6.5 hours per night. That's a problem. Let's get on that. Step 1, boom. Okay, so you're adding via just adjusting some of the things that are already there. So sleep, you've taken care of that. All right, calories. Like, what are you doing with your calories? Okay, yeah, cool. I'm getting my calories in, most days, but I'm under eating then a couple of days as well. Because I'm busy at work. Okay, let's kind of sort that out. Are there other things? Okay, your protein intake is low a couple of days. We could definitely, work on that. We also see that maybe you're not always getting your lower body session in, and the weeks you do then get it in, you're way sorer because you're not consistent with that. Okay, so they're the types of things. They're the types of examples where this starts to become important. Is questions like recovery, things like fat loss, things like muscle gain, because you never want to, or at least most people don't want to. You don't want to have to add in more stuff if what you're doing is already not as useful as it could be, because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to have to do more. That's why I always just, like, I go to the library in UCC, and I sit there sometimes, and like, this probably isn't effective use of my time, but I sit there and I'm looking at people, and they're genuinely, like, they're watching Netflix for an hour, or they're on their phone for an hour, or they're just kind of on ASOS or whatever, and people do that for multiple hours, and I'm like, why are you kidding yourself? Because you're actually not getting the benefit of the free time, because you're still treating it as, oh, I'm in the library, I could be doing something else, but I'm bringing myself to the library. But you're also not getting the benefit of doing the study. So you're just in this area of limbo. And that's where people are with their fitness goals. People are putting in all these efforts and kind of doing, like, constantly adding more stuff, but they haven't even made the most of, like, the real simple things. So if you want to make your life easier, master a couple of the basic things, do that over multiple years, and you'll make progress in all areas of life.
Yeah, and it's actually even easier to see in terms of the diet as well, because what people will do is they won't be consistent in their calories, right? Or their macros, right? But then they're like, oh, well, I'm not getting results, so should I add a fat burner in? As if that's going to be the thing. Or it's like, oh, should I add X supplement in? It's like, the supplement is supposed to be a supplement to the already on point diet. It's like, that's not going to be the make or break thing. If you're not doing, like, think about it, like, we'll say at most you're going to get 1% from a supplement, 1% improvement in whatever metric that supplement is supposed to help, and it's like, if you're not doing the stuff that gets you to 99%, it's like, this is just throwing money away. And you see this a lot in, like, say, the nootropic world. People are like, oh, I need to take this nootropic for concentration, focus, or fucking mental acuity, or verbal recall, or whatever the fuck, right? And it's like, mate, you sleep 5 hours a night. It's like that. Like, it's irrelevant. Like, you can spend your fucking €60 on that supplement, but it's not going to actually be like, yeah, okay, it's going to give you a 1% improvement. But you know what gives you a fucking 90% improvement? Oh yeah, sleeping, getting the stuff, all that kind of stuff done. Like, I always think that as well. Like, when someone asks me about recovery, I'm kind of like recovery shouldn't even enter your mind. It should just be a part of the process. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, you shouldn't have to think of this. You shouldn't even ever feel like you're under recovered, because you have all of the other variables on point. Your diet is appropriate. Your recovery lifestyle stuff is appropriate for your goals. Like, you are practicing stress management, you are sleeping enough, you're doing all that stuff. And like, yeah, initially you might have to tweak some things where you're like, oh yeah, like 8 hours of sleep is probably a good idea. I'm only getting 7, at the start. But when people are talking about, oh, how do I improve recovery, and they're 6 years into training or something, I'm like, this shouldn't even be a concern at this stage. Like, obviously there are certain things where you're like, oh, well, I took up a new sport, or I never squatted before and now I'm starting to squat. It's like, obviously there's issues or reasons why you would start thinking about recovery again. But it's like, once you're over that initial time period, like, it shouldn't be an issue unless you're doing something that's inappropriate for your actual goals. You know what I mean?
Yes, sir.
And then the final bit of this whole puzzle, which is, I actually think that this is why I left it at last. I actually think it's easier to see how this all plays together, is again in the training realm, and obviously I touched on it earlier on, talking about the squats or missing workouts or whatever, but it's actually easy to see how novelty versus consistency actually hinders your results, right? Because if you're going into a workout and there's no structure to that workout and there's no progression to that workout, you're not actually going to see the results you want. Like, if you just go into a training session and you're like, yeah, my goal is to just fucking get my biceps as sore as possible, it's like, well, like, why? Like, are you trying to grow those muscles? Are you trying to get them bigger, stronger, more fucking, I don't know, endurance? It's like, what's the actual reason for that workout. And if it's just to get them as sore as possible, yeah, that's fine. But there's no actual goal. Like we were saying before, it's like that's kind of a side effect of the training process, you know. And while it might get you some results, especially initially, because realistically in beginners, like anything is going to work. And you might also find yourself falling into, like purely by accident, good practices. Like you might be like, we'll say just as an average, you know, like 20 sets for a muscle group per week, you know, is a good hypertrophy, you know, point. You know, if you just say like 20 sets, right? You might find yourself falling into that by accident, where you're like, oh yeah, I do 4 different exercises, 5 sets for each of them, because that just fits into your hour workout or whatever, and you progress as a result, you know. But it's like there's no actual rhyme or reason to it, you know. And also it's like, are you actually progressing to the extent that you could progress to? Because, you know, every single workout you're doing different exercises, and obviously, you know, some exercise variability is good, but there comes a point where you never actually even mastered squatting. You know, like you actually don't know how to squat, because you only ever squat every fucking 6th or 7th workout. You know, it's like, oh yeah, I do leg press this day, I do hack squat this day, you know, I do fucking V squat this day, I do front squats this day, I do fucking, you know, back squats this day, I do Smith machine squat. And you're just always changing up the exercise you do, and you're never actually adapting to that exercise. And well, yes, there is some validity in terms of that, because, you know, you're getting some different stimulus through the muscle, but there's actually no progression even session on session, because there's so much variability. It's like, am I actually getting stronger legs as a result? Are my quads getting stronger, for example? It's like, well, like, what did you do the last time in the hack squat? You're like, oh, I don't really know. I just do whatever feels, you know, heavy enough for 8 or whatever rep target you have. You know, it's like, there's no consistency in terms of the progression here. There's no consistency in terms of the adaptation to the exercise. And there's no rhyme or reason to the overall approach. And I think people are able to see that a lot easier once they kind of realize that consistency in just exercise selection, or consistency in training volume, consistency in intensity, consistency in all the training variables. It's like, oh, I can actually see this week on week progress. You know, like you get a lot of clients come into us and you'll be like, okay, well, let's go through, like set you up with a training program, blah, blah, blah. And they come to you and they're like, oh yeah, I don't know, squat 60 kilos, you know, and they're like, oh, well, I've been training for 3 years. And you're like, you're an 80 kilo male. You know, it's like, if an 80 kilo male came to me and it's like, I only have a 60 kilo squat and I've been training for 3 years, I'm like, were you not squatting? And they're like, oh yeah, I was squatting. And it's like, in my mind, I'm like, what? Like, how did that occur? And you kind of go, okay, cool. Maybe they just have issues with their form, technique, issues with the progression there. Maybe they were injured. I mean, hundreds of variables go through your mind. You're like, okay, cool. We're just going to get you onto a consistent program here. And then you see them completely transform over a 12-week period, where it's like, oh yeah, I came to you with a 60 kilo squat. Now I'm squatting, you know, 160. And you're like, how did this happen? And you kind of dig in a little bit deeper and you realize it's like, they actually had no consistency in squatting, like consistently. You know, it was like, oh, it was something that they occasionally did, usually skipped. You know, this is especially true of leg training, especially for guys. It's like, it's just something that gets skipped all the time. Like the only consistent is they skip squats or legs consistently, you know. And you're like, well, oh, Jesus, like you actually had a huge, you know, area of growth ability that you were just ignoring because you just didn't do it consistently, you know. And it's like your legs are completely different. They've completely like grown, gotten stronger, fucking whatever. And it's like, for most people, they say they are like a hard gainer, or they say they have trouble with whatever issue. And it's like, the only reason is because you haven't actually been consistent in actually doing that, you know, either multiple times per week or at least, you know, weekly, you know?
Yep, there's a good quote, and I don't know where it came from, but it's pretty nice to summarize all of this, and it's that you will not rise to the level of your goals, you will fall to the level of your systems or your habits or whatever. Basically saying that if you don't have you where you are is the result of the things that you do consistently. Okay, like that's fundamentally it. And if you're not making any progress with your studies, with your muscle gain, with your fat loss, they're like the best thing you can possibly do is not look into the future for solutions. It's to look back to see where the faults are. What has been the problem up to this point? And your systems, like for whatever reason, they're not good enough at this point. So you need to make adjustments. And looking for novelty is almost, it's rarely the way forward. Rarely. So don't worry about what they like. Obviously, have goals, have direction, but most importantly, have systems in place that are going to push you in the right direction. And that's the most important thing in every area of life, I think.
So consistency beats novelty, is what you're saying.
I think so.
So I think that answers the question effectively, or hopefully gives people a launching point for thoughts themselves. And again, it is an obvious, apparently obvious thing. It isn't an apparently obvious thing in terms of the actual practical applications of it. Like, again, like people say stuff, they're like, oh yeah, like the 10,000 hour rule for sports, or skill acquisition. And like, even if we disagree with the actual practicality of that or the actual utility of that, like people still understand that you have to put hours in practicing to get good at something. We can disagree on the number, but I think everyone would agree that you have to put the hours in to get good at something. But then people will say they understand that, but then not actually do that themselves. Like, again, like the diet is a good one, because it's like, you say you understand that hours rule, but you are not consistently staying on point with your diet. It's like, how can you expect to get the results that you want if there's no consistency? Same with training. It's like training is a skill. If you're not consistently practicing that skill, how do you expect to get better at that? It's fairly intuitive once you start actually piecing the things together. And you're like, okay, so consistency might be the thing that I'm actually missing in my approach. It may not be that my macros weren't set up perfectly. The issue is probably that you weren't consistently hitting them. Same with like people always say it about, the food pyramid. It's like, oh, the food pyramid is terrible. That's the reason for the obesity epidemic and everything. It's like, the reason diabetes is a thing that is increasing is not because people were following the food pyramid. They weren't consistently following the food pyramid. That wasn't the issue. It's that they were consistently not following the food pyramid or any food advice. So like, I think, do you think that actually helps people in terms of, does that actually, like, is someone listening to this actually thinking, okay, fuck, man, this actually helps me move forward with my goals? Consistency might be the actual thing that I was missing all along. Is this going to help people, Gary?
Yeah, I wonder. Like, the thing is, like, people always say this stuff, and that's why people are probably listening to this podcast and they're like, oh, it's pretty boring, heard all that stuff before. But I mean, if you are not putting it into practice, then you do not understand the implications of this information. Like, you just don't, because you would be putting it into practice. And with the amount of people that I think we see who do not apply these thought processes to their lives, it's very clear that people really don't grasp the concept. And I think you should just give yourself a period of time. Like, what I would do if I was in that place where I was like, oh God, I've actually got no consistency in anything. I'm a student, but I mean, I don't study. I mean, I'll study for exams, and yeah, I go to the gym, but like, I don't have a plan. I was wondering why I wasn't gaining muscle, and yeah, I prep meals some days. Like, for the next 6 months is what I would say. It's like, give yourself a 6-month period where you do not add anything new. Like, your goal is not to add anything new, like in terms of like something novelty, some hack. Like, no more 5 secret tip YouTube videos. No more of them. No more those fitness videos that are like, oh yeah, finally this is the one trick to build a big back. Ditch all that stuff and ask yourself, right, I'm gonna keep my time investment relatively consistent, but what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna strip off all the fluff. I'm gonna get consistent with the important stuff, and then I'll see where I am in 6 months. And if you're still in 6 months' time, you've made no progress, it's like, all right, maybe not. Maybe you do need some more stuff. You need some more novelty. Like, that might be the case. Like, again, like, I think studying is always a good example, because like people will say, oh yeah, I just don't really have time to study. Personal trainers particularly are bad for this. Like, oh, I want to learn more stuff, but I just don't have the time to study. But then you actually look at their screen time on their phone, and they're spending like 3 to 5 hours per day on their phone. And it's like, okay, well, you could definitely get that down to 1. Very few people need to spend more than 1 hour on their phone per day. That could potentially save you 2 to 4 hours per day. 4 hours per day. If you have 4 free hours per day, that's 28 hours a week. You could get a degree with that time. You like that easily. Like, you could easily get a degree with that time availability. Like, if you were to add that up across the week, imagine you did 4 hours of, like, obviously I don't expect all personal trainers to do 4 hours of study every day, but even if you just did 1 hour, like, you take 1 hour, you pick a topic, you try to understand it a bit better, and you do that over the course of multiple years, you're going to have a pretty damn good understanding of a lot of different topics. Or what you could do is just kind of, keep reading short posts on Instagram and be like, oh yeah, that's kind of interesting, I must read up on that, and then on to the next one, because that's where people get their education. And I think that's definitely a place where people can put this into practice, but of course, still the training, nutrition stuff too.
Do people still use Instagram?
They do. Like, this scrolling.
Interesting.
Stories. Watching stories, been like, oh, she got a new dress. Oh, that's so cool. I wonder where she got that. And then scroll ASOS for like 2 hours as well. Guys do that too, so not just girls.
That's fair enough. Do guys buy dresses, Gary?
They do.
It's very progressive of you.
You don't know that?
That's good. Because usually you're a bigot, but anyway.
No, I'm very progressive.
So, what you're saying is the only novelty people should bring into their plan is the novelty of consistency.
Pretty boring, lads, but I mean, we'll see who's who in 10 years.
You're dead right, Gary. Now, the question is, where can people consistently engage with us?
You can engage with us in the Triage Method community. It's a group on Facebook, open access. You can access
Links below.
Link below. You can access different things that we post in there. We generally post, a number of interesting research papers or articles or anything like that we might have been reading that we're not necessarily sharing anywhere else. Sometimes we'll give a synopsis and some, of the implications of that study, like what that might actually mean for you. We also analyze people's training clips. If you want to send us training clips, like let's do it. That's another thing that ties into this conversation. It might be the case that you've been bench pressing for 3 years, your chest has never grown, and maybe you just need some tips on how to improve the way that you perform it. And that could be, the little change that makes that consistency worth it. So that's a good thing that you could do. Triage Method community, that is. And then you could, of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are consistently posting YouTube videos now, at least we're getting like 2 vlogs / instructive videos up per week, along with these podcast videos. Of course, if you just listen to the podcast, I'd recommend that you watch, because sometimes
nobody wants to see our faces, Gary. Let's be serious.
Sometimes we look cute. Sometimes my delts might look a little bit juicy, or Paddy's beard is looking extra fine. So that might be a little bonus, little Easter egg.
Actually, legitimately, we were saying this before the podcast, right? Legitimately, we both have lab coats. I reckon we should just start wearing lab coats for the podcast, right? So if you're a listener, you will never know if we actually implement this plan. Right? But there is a very high possibility that in future we will be wearing our lab coats for the podcast. So the entire time, or our gis, right? Our kimonos. So there's a very real possibility that if you're not subscribed to YouTube, we may in fact be wearing clothing that we won't mention, that only the YouTube subscribers will see. But we may also not, so who knows?
I'm definitely going to do it.
Anyway, you didn't finish. Where else can people find us? Or how can they engage with us, Gary?
You can follow us on the Instagrams, of course. You know, we share most of the stuff that's going on other platforms.
Just told them to get off Instagram.
Yeah, like honestly, if you have to unsubscribe from Triage and delete your Instagram, like I'm okay with that. You know, I think it's actually worth it. That trade-off for your life is just probably worth it. So you could do that. But if you do happen to stick around on Instagram, before you disable your account, just click subscribe, you know, to Triage Method, just so, you know, or follow, so that we've got that little extra follower. Although I'm not so sure if you stay around as a follower there. Anyway, other things you could do, check out our website, you know, triagemethod.com. That's where we post all of our articles, podcasts, etc. Everything you're going to find there. There's some recommended resources on our website that we just added. So recommended websites, different pieces of gym equipment that you might want to use, things like that, you know, stuff that people are generally looking for. And then the other thing is, what else do people need to do? Subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, leave your comments, give us suggestions for what you'd like to hear. There's a questions box below, so you can send us a question that will be answered on the podcast, or we might even write an article about it, so that could be good, or it'll be the topic of a YouTube video, but we will get around to your questions if they are good questions. And I think that's most of what people need to know. Of course, you could engage with our services on the Triage Method store, or triagemethod.com/online coaching, or /group coaching. The online coaching service is a one-to-one service, of course, as you know. We do have some availability at the moment, as we alluded to in one of the previous episodes, or no, in the future episode, damn it.
Previous.
Oh yeah, it will be previous. In the previous episode, as we've had, you know, we have clients that finish up every now and then, some people that come on for stints of 3 to 6 months. So that's why we do have, you know, some availability every time we mention it, but there is an upper limit, and there definitely is an upper limit, because we don't have that time with college to be taking on like 50 clients so each. But yeah, online coaching, group coaching, ebooks, program templates, all on the website.
You did good, Gary.
Such a shield for big Triage.
Yeah, they pay well though, don't they?
Oh, they do. I'm getting paid by Big Pharma now as well, because I'm a medical student. Too easy.
Oh yeah, that's nice.
Lucrative, like.
Their paycheck isn't great though.
Pfizer are pretty sound.
Yeah, but you have to keep real quiet about stuff as well, like, you know, vaccines and stuff. You have to like not say anything about it.
Oh yeah, I can't actually tell people that, you know, vaccines are actually a public program to, you know, make sure that cancer spreads, you know, worldwide and stuff like that. You know, that's what they're for.
And give people autism so they don't question big government.
Of course.
That's how I got it anyway. So I have nothing else to add to this conversation. In fact, I need to urinate quite a lot. So I'm going to wrap this up here, Gary. Do you have anything to add, or have you spoken all you wish to speak?
I've spoken all I wish to speak for the moment. Of course, I don't know, like the podcast, I already said that. So yeah, it's too easy, guys. Have a great week. Be consistent. That's the message for this week.
Love you guys. XOXO.